Namaste, good morning, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, students, scholars, sportsmen, friends, colleagues, professionals and officials throughout from the world of science, spirituality, religion, engineering, arts, commerce, and the most honorable present Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi ji, respected the most reverend fathers, mothers, doctors, ministers, those who are listening. I, Dr. Rakesh from USA, I thank God for your presence, for listening the word of truth through science and spirituality. There are many questions in our youth, in our children, in our sons and lovers, daughters, those who love the nation, those who love physically, materialistically. It is rightly said that you can love your country without hating with another country. What kind of love is it? What kind of love is it about which William Shakespeare has explained throughout his mind mapping? Let me do the marriage of hearts, let me know to the marriage of minds. Internationally, cosmopolitanically, you can love your country without hating with another country. You can love your beloved without hating with others. So, what a great message which is being spread out by our present Prime Minister, who is the stanch and ardent believer, follower, devotee of Swami Vivekananda. What does Swami Vivekananda has explored, researched for our internal spirit and soul? That is landmark and milestone in the history of all the religions, in all the languages, in all the sects of the world. Just by two words, a person in the form of person, great man of great men, created upheaval just by expressing and addressing two words in America, 1893, Chicago religious congregation. After that, everyone knew that what is the power of Indian culture, how much power Indian culture has. Later on, by going through our holy scriptures, the Vedas, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, all these were followed, read by the foreigners, and in exchange of that they researched in their country, and in exchange of that they are supplying goods, facilities, luxuries for spreading their business. Initially in 1600, British East India Company came in India, in Delhi, for spreading the business. In 1498, Vasco da Gama already have discovered India. There is a land, there is a level, there is a brand, India, which is the most prosperous country in the world. He spread it out, he sent this message to the English government, British people, all over the Europe. This message was sent to them, and English companies tried to rule over our all boundaries of our nation. What happened later on? Started exploitation, started humanization, started inhuman activities, harassment, slavery system. It was started by the English people for the illiterate, uneducated, ignored people. But nowadays we have entered into the modernism. Our country has got independence. We are born in the freedom of the country. So we must be free spiritually, to thought, to fight for our own means, not physically only, but spiritually, which is the most, which is the greatest, which is the highest valuable peak point of our soul, spirit, aim, ambition, motto, motive. How the soul, how the spirit can gain, how the spirit can be free, about which a Nobel Prize winner has told us, where the mind is without free. How a great personality has expressed the truth and non-violence. How our Indian culture has induced in our mind, thought, body, patience, compassion, sympathy, love, platonic love, love of motherland, a number of human values and moralities, spiritualities have infused with our great saints, prophets, free thinkers, messengers. Our present Prime Minister, who is enforcing us, who is emphasizing us to follow the path of independency, like Swami Vivekananda, who told to the whole world that return to the Vedas. Earlier, there were Some poets who have written, return to nature, return to your childhood. But for the nation and for the society, if really you are the believer, follower of this motherland, then you must follow the path of Swami Vivekananda, who told us, return to the Vedas. The Vedas have written by the saints, those who are fully devoted and dedicated for the welfare of humanity, for the welfare of human beings, creation, the whole creation. So, we must follow the message, return to the Vedas. This word return has the greatest value in the scenario in reference of the Indian mythology for reforming our India. Return, reform, restoration, record. We are the believer of re. We are not only the believer of re, but the whole English worldly people, they also believe in this theory, in this doctrine, in this principle. On this principle, they believe and they have become pastors of the world. Means they record the pastoral events, incidents in their mind about each and every incident, about personalities and about places. They keep the record in their mind. Means their mind power is working and mind power is ruling over all the world. How? Because of the theory of Swami Vivekananda's renunciation theory. There are so many questions we have in our mind, and there are multiplied, uncounted realizations, uncounted answers are available in our holy scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. If we will go through this one, then definitely our land will again become the land of scientists, the land of engineers, the land of technicians, the land of inventors, discoverers, researchers. But for that, we must have to sacrifice by having patience. We are to be able, as our present Prime Minister has sacrificed his whole life for the nation, for the glory of our country. He brought name, fame in the world, and he doesn't care the critics. Criticism is the appreciation for this Prime Minister. Criticism is the admiration. Because of strong will, spiritually he is strong, spiritually he is powerful, he is fearless and friendly with all the worldly people. Wherever he goes, wherever he went, wherever he is to go, he spreads the message of humanity in the form of true trader. He is spreading the business of humanity, about which our inventors, starters, beginners, initiators has explained all in one, one in all. This is the principle, this is the doctrine of our present Prime Minister. Nobody can refuse and ignore from these principles, because these principles are the fundamentals, foundation of our culture, civilization, languages, sects all over the world. Wherever, whenever our Prime Minister has gone, it is in the blood, it is in his heart, it is in his soul that he is to spread the message of Indianness, nationality. So being a true nationalistic, patriotistic, he is working in all the fields of our country. But after all, being unselfish, selfless, we must keep in our mind that our soul is immortal. Is the soul immortal? None has power to destroy the unchangeable. In the great Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, the story is told how the hero Yudhishthira, when asked by Dharma to tell what was the most wonderful thing in the world, replied that it was the persistent belief of mankind in their own deathlessness. In spite of their witnessing death everywhere around them, almost every moment of their lives. And in fact, this is the most stupendous wonder in human life. In spite of all arguments to the country, in spite of all arguments to the contrary, asked in different times by different persons, by different prophets, by different free thinkers, and even schools, in spite of the inability of reason to penetrate the veil of mystery which will ever hang between the sensuous and the supersensuous words. Man is thoroughly persuaded that he cannot die. We may study all our lives and in the end fail to bring the problem of life and death to the plane of rational demonstration, affirmative or negative. We may talk or write, preach or teach, for or against the permanency or impermanency of human existence as much as we like. We may become violent partisans of this side of that. We may invent names by the hundred, each more intricate than its predecessor, and lull ourselves into the momentary rest under the delusion of our having solved the problem once for all. We may cling with all our powers to any of the curious religious superstitions or the far more objectionable scientific superstitions. But in the end, we find ourselves playing an eternal game in the bowling alley of reason and raising intellectual pin after pin, only to be knocked over again and again But behind all this mental strain and torture, not infrequently productive of more dangerous results than mere games, stands a fact unchallenged and unchangeable. The fact, the wonder which the Mahabharata points out as the inability of our mind to conceive our own annihilation, even to imagine my own annihilation, I shall have to stand by and look on as a witness. Now, before trying to understand what this curious phenomena means, we want to note that upon this one fact the whole world stands. The permanence of the external world is inevitably joined to the permanence of the internal. And how plausible any theory of the universe may seem, which asserts the permanence of the one and denies that of the other. The theorist himself will find that in his own mechanism, not one conscious action is possible without the permanence of both the internal and external worlds. Being one of the factors in the motive cause, although it is perfectly true that when the human mind transcends its own limitations, it finds the duality reduced to an invisible unity on this side of the unconditioned, the whole objective world. This is to say, the world we know is and can be alone known to us as existing for the subject, and therefore before we could be able to conceive the annihilation of the subject, we are bound to conceive the annihilation of the object. So far it is plain enough, but now comes the difficulty. I cannot think of myself ordinarily as anything else but a body. My idea of my own permanence include my idea of myself as a body. But the body is obviously impermanent, as it is the whole of nature, a constantly vanishing quantity. Where then is this permanence? There is one more wonderful phenomena connected with our lives, without which who will be able to live? Who will be able to enjoy life a moment? The idea of freedom. The idea of freedom, this is the idea that guides each footstep of ours, makes our movements possible, determines our relations to each other, nay, is the very warp and woof in the fabric of human life. Intellectual knowledge tries to drive it inch by inch from its territory. Post after post is snatched away from its domains, and each step is made fast and iron bound with the railroadings of cause and effect. But it laughs at all our attempts, and lo, it keeps itself above all this massive pile of law and causation with which we tried to smother it to death. How can it be otherwise? The limited always requires a higher generation of the unlimited to explain itself. The bound can only be explained by the free. The caused by the uncaused. But again, the same difficulty is also here. What is free? The body or even the mind? It is apparent to all that they are as much bound by law as anything else in the universe. Now the problem resolves itself into this dilemma. Either the whole universe is a mass of never ceasing change and nothing more, irrevocably bound by the law of causation, not only particle having a unity of itself, yet it is curiously producing an ineradicable delusion of permanence and freedom. Or even there is in us and in the universe something which is permanent, something which is permanent and free, showing that the basal constitutional belief of the human mind is not a delusion. It is the duty of science to explain facts by bringing them to a higher generation. Any explanation, therefore, that first wants to destroy a part of the fact given to be explained in order to fit itself to the remainder is not scientific, whatever else it may be. So any explanation that wants to overlook the fact of this persistent and all necessary idea of freedom commits the above mentioned mistake of denying a portion of the fact in order to explain the rest and is therefore wrong. The only other alternative possible then is to acknowledge in harmony with our nature that there is something in us which is free and permanent, but it is not the body, neither is it the mind. The body is dying every minute. The mind is constantly changing. The body is a combination, and so is the mind, and as such can never reach to a state beyond all change, but beyond this momentary sheathing of gross matter, beyond even the fine covering of the mind is the Atma, the true self of man, the permanent, the ever free. It is his freedom that is percolating through layers of thought and matter, and in spite of the colorings of name and form is ever asserting its unshackled existence. It is his deathlessness, his bliss, his peace, his divinity that shines out and makes itself felt in spite of the thickest layers of ignorance. He is the real man, the fearless one, the deathlessness one, the free. Now, freedom is only possible when no external power can exert any influence, produce any change. Freedom is only possible to the being who is beyond all conditions, all laws, all bondages of cause and effect. In other words, the unchangeable alone can be free and therefore immortal. This being, this Atma, this real self of man, the free, the unchangeable is beyond all conditions, and as such, it has neither birth nor death. Without birth or death, eternal, ever existing, is this soul of man. What is said about our reincarnation in our holy scripture? Both you and I have passed through many births. You know them not, I know them all. Of the many riddles that have perplexed the intellect of man in all claims and times, the most intricate is himself. Of the myriad mysteries that have called forth his energies to struggle for solution from the very dawn to history, from the very dawn of history, the most mysterious is his own nature. It is at once the most insoluble enigma and the problem of all problems. At the starting point and the repository of all, we know and feel and do. There never has been, nor will be, a time when man's own nature will cease to demand his best and foremost attention. Though through hunger, after that truth, which of all others has the most intimate connection with his very existence, though through an all-observing desire for an inward standard by which to measure the outward universe, though through the absolute and inherent necessity of finding a fixed point in a universe of change, man has sometimes clutched at handfuls of dust for gold, and even when urged on by a voice higher than reason or intellect, he has many times failed rightly to interpret the real meaning of the divinity within. Still, there never was a time since the search began when some race or some individuals did not hold aloft the lamp of truth, taking a one-sided cursory and prejudiced view of the surroundings and the unessential details, sometimes disgusted also with the vagueness of many schools and sects, and often, alas, driven to the opposite extreme by the violent superstitions of organized priestcraft. Men have not been wanting, especially among advanced intellects in either ancient or modern times, who not only gave up the search in despair but declared it fruitless and useless. Philosophers might fret and sneer, and priests ply their trade even at the point of the sword. But truth comes to those alone who worship at her shrine, for her sake only, without fear and without shopkeeping. Light comes to individuals through the conscious efforts of their intellect. It comes slowly, though, to the whole race through unconscious percolations. The philosophers show the volitional struggles of great minds. History reveals the silent process of formation through which the truth is absorbed by the masses. Of all the theories that have been held by man about himself, that of a soul entity, separated from the body and immortal, has been the most widespread and among those that held the belief in such a soul. The majority of the thoughtful had always believed also in its pre-existence. At present, the greatest portion of the human race, having organized religion, believe in it, and many of the best thinkers in the most favored lands, through nurtured in religions, avowedly hostile to every idea of the pre-existence of the soul, have endorsed it. Hinduism and Buddhism it for their foundation. The educated classes among the ancient Egyptians believed in it. The ancient Persians arrived at it. The Greek philosophers made it the cornerstone of their philosophy. The Pharisees among the Hebrews accepted it, and the Sufis among the Mohammedans almost universally acknowledged its truth. There must be peculiar surroundings which generate and foster certain forms of belief among nations. It required ages for the ancient races to arrive at any idea about a part, even of the body, surviving after death. It took ages more to come to any rational idea about this, something which persists and lives apart from the body. It was only when the idea was reached of an entity for a time, and only among those nations who arrived at such a conclusion, that the unavoidable question arose, whither or whence. The ancient Hebrews never disturbed their equanimity by questioning themselves about the soul. With them death ended all. Karl Haeckel justly says, though it is true that in the Old Testament preceding the exile, the Hebrews distinguish a life principle different from the body, which is sometimes called nephesh or ruach or neshama. Yet all these words correspond rather to the idea of breath than to that of spirit or soul. Also in the writings of the Palestinians, Jews after the exile, there is never made mention of an individual immortal soul, but always only of a life breath emanating from God, which after the body is dissolved is reabsorbed into the divine ruach. The ancient Egyptians and the Chaldeans had peculiar beliefs of their own about the soul, but their ideas about this living part after death must not be confused with those of the ancient Hindu, the Persian, the Greek, or any other Aryan race. There was from the earliest times a broad distinction between the Aryans and the non-Sanskrit speaking Mlecchas in the conception of the soul. Externally it was typified. By their disposal of the dead. The Mlecchas mostly trying their best to preserve their dead bodies, either by careful burial or by the more elaborate processes of mummifying, and the Aryans generally burning their dead. Herein lies the key to a great secret. The fact that no Mleccha race, whether Egyptian, Assyrian, or Babylonian, ever attained to the idea of the soul as a separate entity which can live independent of the body without the help of the Aryans, especially of the Hindus. All the Herodotus states that the Egyptians were the first to conceive the idea of the immortality of the soul, and states as a doctrine of the Egyptians that the soul after the dissolution of the body enters again and again into a creature that comes to life. Then that the soul wanders through all the animals of the land and the sea and through all the birds, and finally after 3000 years return to a human body. Yet modern researches into Egyptology have hitherto found no trace of metempsychosis in the popular Egyptian. Giveth to all who dwell upon it, is for me stagnate and dead. That water floweth to all who are on earth, while for me it is but liquid putrefaction. This water that is mine. Since I came into this funeral valley, I knew not where nor what I am. Give me to drink of running water. Let me be placed by the edge of the water with my face to the north, that the breeze may caress me and my heart be refreshed from its sorrow. Among the Chaldeans also, although they did not speculate so much as the Egyptians as to the condition of the soul after death, the soul is still a double and is bound to its sepulture. They also could not conceive of a state without this physical body and expected a resurrection of the corpse again to life. And though the goddess Esther, after great perils and adventures, procured the resurrection of her shepherd husband, Demuzi the son of Ea, and Damkina, the most pious votaries, pleaded in vain from temple to temple for the resurrection of their body friends, for their dead friends. Thus we find that the ancient Egyptians or Chaldeans never could entirely dissociate the idea of the soul from the corpse of the departed or the sepulture. The state of earthly existence was best after all, and the departed are always longing to have a chance once more to renew it, and the living are fervently hoping to help them in prolonging the existence of the miserable double, and striving the best they can do help them. This is not the soil out of which any higher knowledge of the soul could spring. In the first place, it is grossly materialistic, and even then it is one of the terror and agony. Frightened by the almost innumerable powers of evil, and with hopeless agonized efforts to avoid them, the souls of living, like their ideas of the souls of the departed, wander all over the world, through they might could never get beyond the sepulchre and the crumbling corpse. We must turn now for the source of the higher ideas of the soul to another race, whose God was an all merciful, all pervading being, manifesting himself through various bright, benign, and helpful devas, the first of all the human race, who addressed their God as Father. Oh, take me by the hands, even as a father takes his dear son, with whom life was a hope and not a despair, whose religion was not the intermittent groans escaping from the lips of an agonized man during the intervals of a life of mad excitement, but whose ideas come to us redolent with the aroma of the field and forest, whose songs of praise, spontaneous, free, joyful, like the songs which burst forth from the throats of the birds when they hail this beautiful word, illuminated by the first rays of the Lord of the day, come down to us even now through the vistas of 80 centuries. As fresh calls from heaven, we turn to the ancient Aryans. Place me in that deathless, undecaying word. Where is the light of heaven and everlasting lust? Lust shines. Everlasting lust shines. Make me immortal in that realm where dwells the King, Vivashwan's son. Where is the secret shrine of heaven? Make me immortal in that realm where they move even as they list. In the third sphere of inmost heaven, where words are full of light, make me immortal in that realm of bliss. These are the prayers of the Aryans in their oldest record, the Rig Veda Samhita. We find at once a whole world of difference between the Mlecchas and the Aryan ideals. To the one, this body and the world are all that are real and all that are desirable. A little life flute which flies off from the body at death to feed torture and agony at the loss of the enjoyments of the senses. Can they fondly hope be brought back if the body is carefully preserved? And thus a corpse became more an object of care than the living being, than the living man. The other found that which left the body was the real man, and when separated from the body, it enjoyed a state of bliss higher than it ever enjoyed when in the body, and they hastened to annihilate the culprit corpse by burning it. Here we find the gem. Here we find the gem out of which a true idea of the soul could come. Here it was where the real man was not the body but the soul, where all ideas of an inseparable connection between the real man and the body were utterly absent, that a noble idea of the freedom of the soul could arise. And it was when the Aryans penetrated even beyond the shining cloth of the body with which the departed soul was enveloped, and found its real nature of a formless, indivisible unit principle, that the question inevitably arose whence. It was in India and among the Aryans that the doctrine of the pre-existence, the immortality and the indivisibility of the soul first arose. Recent researches in Egypt have failed to show any trace of the doctrines of an independent and individual soul existing before and after the earthly phase of existence. Some of the mysteries were no doubt in possession of this idea, but in those it has been traced to India. I am convinced, says Karl Haeckel, that the deeper we enter into the study of the Egyptian religion, the clearer it is shown that the doctrine of metempsychosis was entirely foreign to the popular Egyptian religion, and that even that which single mysteries possessed of it was not inherent to the Osiris teachings but derived from Hindu sources. Later on we find the Alexandrian Jew imbued with the doctrine of an individual soul, and the Pharisees of the time of Jesus, all, as already stated, not only had faith in an individual soul but believed in its wanderings through the various bodies, and thus it is easy to find how Christ was recognized as the incarnation of an older prophet. And Jesus himself directly asserted that John the Baptist was the prophet Elias come back again. If ye will receive it, this is Elias, which was for to come. Matthew 11, word number 14. It is mentioned the idea of a soul and of its individuality among the Hebrews evidently came through the higher mystical teachings of the Egyptians, who in their turn derived it from India, and that it should come through Alexandrian is significant, as the Buddhistic records clearly show. Buddhistic missionary activity in Alexandria and Asia Minor Pythagoras is said to have been the first Greek who taught the doctrine of palingenesis among the Hellenes as an Aryan race already burning their dead and believing in the doctrine of an individual soul. It was easy for the Greeks to accept the doctrine of reincarnation. Through the Pythagorean teachings, according to Apuleius, Pythagoras had come to India where he had been instructed by the Brahmins. So far we have learnt that wherever the soul was held to be an individual, the real man and not a vivifying part of the body only, the doctrine of its pre-existence had inevitably come, and that externally those nations that believed in the independent individuality of the soul had almost always signified it by burning the bodies of the departed. Though one of the ancient Aryan races, the Persian, developed at an early period and without any Semitic influence a peculiar method of disposing of the bodies of the dead. The very name by which they call their towers of silence comes from the root daha, to burn. the to burn. In short, the races who did not pay much attention to the analysis of their own nature never went beyond the material body as their all in all, and even when driven by higher light to penetrate beyond, they only came to the conclusion that somehow or other, at some distance period of time, this body will become incorruptible. On the other hand, that race which spent the best part of its energies in the inquiry into the nature of man as a thinking being, the Indo-Aryan, soon found out that beyond this body, beyond even the shining body, which their forefathers longed after, is the real man, the principal, the individual who clothes himself with this body and then throws it off when worn out. Was such a principle created? If creation means something coming out of nothing, their answer is a decisive no. This soul is without birth and without death. It is not a compound or combination, but an independent individual, and as such it cannot be created or destroyed. It is only traveling through various states. Naturally, the question arises, where is he? Where is all this time? Where it all this time? The Hindu philosophers say it was passing through different bodies in the physical sense, or really and metaphysically speaking, passing through different mental planes. Are there any proofs apart from the teachings of the Vedas upon which the doctrine of reincarnation has been founded by the Hindu philosophers? There are, and we hope to show later on that there are grounds as valid for it as for any other universally accepted doctrine. But first, we will see what some of the greatest of modern European thinkers have thought about reincarnation. I.H. Fichte, speaking about the immortality of the soul, says, it is true, there is one analogy in nature which might be brought forth in reputation of the continuation. It is the well-known argument that everything that has a beginning in time must also perish at some period. Some period of time. Hence, that the claimed past existence of the soul necessarily implies its pre-existence. This is a fair conclusion, but instead of being an objection to, it is rather an additional argument for its continuation, for its continuance. Indeed, one needs only to understand the full meaning of the metaphysico, psychological axiom that in reality nothing can be created or annihilated, to recognize that the soul must have existed prior to its becoming visible in a physical body. Scopenhauer, in his book Die Welt, Alice Ville and Vostelland, speaking about Palingenesis, says, what sleep is for the individuals, death is for the will. It could not endure to continue the same actions and sufferings throughout an eternity without true gain. If memory and individuality remained to it, it flings them off, and this is Lethe, and through this sleep of death, it reappears fitted out with another intellect as a new being. A new day tempts to new source. These constant new births then constitute the succession of the life dreams of a will, which in itself is indestructible until instructed and improved by so much and much various successive knowledge in a constantly new form, it abolishes and abrogates itself. It must not be neglected. It must not be neglected that even empirical grounds support a palingenesis of this kind. As a matter of fact, there does exist a connection between the birth of the newly appearing beings and the death of those that are worn out. It shows itself in the great fruitfulness of the human race, which appears as a consequence of devastating diseases. When in the 14th century the Black Death had for the most part depopulated the old world, a quite abnormal fruitfulness appeared among the human race, and twin births were very frequent. This circumstance was also remarkable that none of the children born at this time obtained their full number of teeth. Thus nature, exerting itself to the utmost, was niggardly in details. This is related by F. Saknurer in his Chronique der Sossen 1825, Casper also in his Über die Vibrationalische Lebensdauer des Menschen 1835 confirms the principle that the number of births in a given population has the most decided influence upon the length of life and morality in it, mortality in it, as this always keeps pace when mortality, so that always and everywhere the deaths and the births increase and decrease in like proportion, which he places beyond the doubt by an accumulation of evidence collected from many lands and their various provinces. And yet it is impossible that there can be a physical causal connection between my early death and the fruitfulness of a marriage with which I have nothing to do, or conversely. Thus here the metaphysical appears undeniable, and in a stupendous manner as the immediate ground of explanation of the physical, Every newborn being comes fresh and breathes into the new existence and enjoys it as a free gift. But there is and can be nothing freely given. Its fresh existence is paid for by the old age and death of a worn out existence which has perished, but which contained the indestructible seed out of which the new existence has arisen. They are one being. The great English philosopher Hume, nihilistic though he was, says in the susceptible essay on immortality, the mumpy psychosis is therefore the only system of this kind that philosophy can listen to. The philosopher, lacing with a deep poetical insight, asks, is this hypothesis so laughable merely because it is the eldest, because it is the oldest, because the human understanding before the sophistries of the schools had dissipated and debilitated it, lighted upon it at once? Why should not I come back as often as I am capable of acquiring fresh knowledge, fresh experience? Do I bring away so much from once that there is nothing to repay, the trouble of coming back? The arguments for and against the doctrine of a pre-existing soul reincarnating through many lives. The arguments for and against the doctrine of a pre-existing soul reincarnating through many lives have been many, and some of the greatest thinkers of all ages have taken up the gauntlet to defend it. And so far as we can see, if there is an individual soul, that it existed before seems inevitable. If the soul is not an inevitable but a combination of skandhas, means notions, as the Madhyamikas among the Buddhists insist, still they find pre-existence absolutely necessary to explain their position. The argument showing the impossibility of an infinite existence beginning in time is unanswerable, though attempts have been made to ward it off by appealing to the omnipotence of God to do anything, however contrary to reason it may be. We are sorry to find this most fallacious argument proceeding from some of the most thoughtful persons. In the first place, God being the universal and common cause of all phenomena, the question was to find the natural causes of certain phenomena in the human soul, and the Deus ex machina theory is therefore quite irrelevant. It amounts to nothing less than confession of ignorance. We can give that answer to every question asked in every branch of human knowledge and stop all inquiry, and therefore knowledge altogether. Secondly, this constant appeal to the omnipotence of God is only a word puzzle. The cause as cause. The cause as cause is and can only be known to us as sufficient for the effect and nothing more. As such, we have no more idea of an infinite effect than of an omnipotent cause. Moreover, all our ideas of God are only limited. Even the idea of cause limits our idea of God. Thirdly, even taking the position for granted, we are not bound to allow any such absurd theories as something coming out of nothing or infinitely beginning in time, so long as we can give a better explanation. A so-called great argument is made against the idea of pre-existence by asserting that the majority of mankind are not conscious of it. To prove the validity of this argument, the party who offers it must prove that the whole of the soul of man is bound up in the faculty of memory. If memory be the test of existence, then all that part of our lives which is not now in it must be non-existent, and every person who in a state of coma or otherwise loses his memory must be non-existent also. The premises from which the inference is drawn of a previous existence, and that too on the plane of conscious action, as adduced by the Hindu philosophers, are chiefly these. How else to explain this word of inequalities? Here is one child born in the providence of a just and merciful God, with every circumstance conducing to his becoming a good and useful member of the human race. And perhaps at the same instant and in the same city, and another child is born under circumstances every one of which is against his becoming good. We see children born to suffer, perhaps all their lives, and that owing to no fault of theirs. Why should it be so? What is the cause? Of whose ignorance is it the result? If not the child's, why should it suffer for its parents' actions? It is much better to confess ignorance than to try to evade the question by the allurements of future enjoyments in proportion to the evil here, or by posing mysteries. Not only undeserved suffering forced upon us by any agent is immoral, not to say unjust, but even the future making of theory has no legs to stand upon. How many of the miserably born struggle towards a higher life, and how many more succumb to the circumstances they are placed under? Should those who grow worse and more wicked by being forced to be born under evil circumstances be rewarded in the failure in the future for the wickedness of their lives? In that cases, the more wicked the man is here, the better will be his deserts hereafter. There is no other way to vindicate the glory and the liberty of the human soul and reconcile the inequalities and the horrors of this world. Then by placing the whole burden upon the legitimate cause, our own independent actions or karma, not only so, but every theory of the creation of the soul from nothing inevitably leads to fatalism and preordinance, and instead of a merciful Father places before us a hideous, cruel and an ever angry God to worship. And so far as the power of religion for God or evil, for good or evil is concerned, this theory of a created soul leading to its corollaries of fatalism and predestination is responsible for the horrible idea prevailing among Christians and Mohammedans that the heathens are the lawful victims of their swords and all the horrors that have followed and are following it still, but an argument which the philosophers of the Nyaya school have always advanced in favor of reincarnation, and which to us seems conclusive is this: our experiences cannot be annihilated. Our actions, means karmas, through apparently disappearing remains still unperceived, means adrishta, unperceived, and reappear again in their effect as their tendencies, means pravartis, tendencies. Even little babies come with certain tendencies. Fear of death, for example. Now, if a tendency is the result of repeated actions, the tendencies with which we are born must be explained on their ground too. Evidently, we could not have got them in this life. Therefore, we must have to seek for their genesis in the past. Now it is also evident that some of our tendencies are the effects of the self-conscious efforts peculiar to man, and if it is true that we are born with such tendencies, it rigorously follows that their causes were conscious efforts in the past. That is, we must have been on the same mental plane which we call the human plane before this present life. So far as explaining the tendencies of the present life by past conscious efforts goes, the reincarnationists of India and the latest school of evolutionists are at one. The only difference is that the Hindus, as spiritualists, explain it by the conscious efforts of individual souls, and the materialistic schools of evolutionists by in hereditary physical transmission. The schools which hold to the theory of creation out of nothing are entirely out of court. The issue has to be fought out between the reincarnationists. The issue has to be fought out between the reincarnationists who hold that all experiences are stored up as tendencies in the subject of those experiences, the individual soul, and are transmitted by incarnation of that unbroken individuality, and the materialists who hold that the brain is the subject of all actions and the theory of the transmission through cells. It is thus that the doctrine of reincarnation assumes an infinite importance to our mind. For the fight between reincarnation and mere cellular transmission is, in reality, the fight between spiritualism and materialism. If cellular transmission is the self, if cellular transmission is the all-sufficient explanation, materialism is inevitable, and there is no necessity for the theory of a soul if it is not a sufficient explanation. The theory of an individual soul bringing into this life the experiences of the past is absolutely true. There is no escape from the alternative, reincarnation or materialism, which shall be accept. What is written about our life after death? Here comes a very interesting question. That question, which is generally known as the reincarnation of the soul. Sometimes people get frightened at the idea, and superstition is so strong that thinking men even believe that they are the outcome of nothing. And then with the grandest logic try to deduce the theory that although they have come out of zero, they will be eternal ever afterwards. Those that come out of zero will certainly have to go back to zero. Neither you nor I nor anyone present has come out of zero, nor will go back to zero. We have been existing eternally and will exist, and there is no power under the sun or above the sun which can undo your or my existence or send us back to zero. Now, this idea of reincarnation is not only not a frightening idea, but is most essential for the moral well-being of the human race. It is the only logical conclusion that thoughtful man can arrive at. If you are going to exist in eternity, the hereafter, it must be that you have existed through eternity in the past. It cannot be otherwise. I will try to answer a few objections that are generally brought against the theory, although many of you will think they are very silly objections. Still, we have to answer them, for sometimes we find that the most thoughtful men are ready to advance the silliest ideas. Well has it been, well has it been said that there never was an idea to assure that it did not find philosophers to defend it. The first objection is, why do we not remember our past? Do we remember all our past in this life? How many of you remember what you did when you were babies? None of you remember your early childhood. And if upon memory depends your existence, then this argument proves that you did not exist as babies because you do not remember your babyhood. It is simply unmitigated nonsense to say that our existence depends on our remembering it. Why should we remember the past? That brain is gone, broken into pieces, and a new brain has been manufactured. When has come to this brain is the resultant, the sum total of the impression acquired in our past, with which the mind has come to inhabit the new body. I, as I stand here, am the effect, the result of all the infinite past, which is tagged on to me. And why is it necessary for me to remember all the past? When a great ancient saga, a seer or a prophet of old who came face to face with the truth says something, these modern men stand up and say, "Oh, he was a fool, but just use another name." Huxley says it, or Tyndall, then it must be true, and they take it for granted. In place of ancient superstitions, they have erected modern superstitions. In place of the old popes of religion, they have installed modern popes of science. So, we see that this objection as to memory is not valid. And that is about the only serious objection that is raised against the theory. Although we have seen that it is not necessary for the theory that there shall be the memory of past lives, yet at the same time we are in a position to assert that there are instances which show that this memory does come, and that each one of us will get back this memory in that life in which he will become free. Then alone you will find that this world is but a dream. Then alone you will realize in the soul of your soul that you are but actors and the world is a stage. Then alone will the idea of non-attachment come to you with the power of thunder. Then all this thirst for enjoyment, this clinging on to life and this world will vanish forever. Then the mind will see clearly as daylight how many times all these existed for you, how many millions of times you have fathers, how many millions of times you had fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, relatives and friends, wealth and power. They came and went. How many times you were on the topmost crest of the wave, and how many times you were down at the bottom of despair. When memory will bring all these to you, then alone will you stand as a hero and smile. When the world frowns upon you, then alone will you stand up and say, I care not for thee even or death. What terrors hast thou for me? This will come to all. Are there any arguments, any rational proofs for this reincarnation of the soul? So far we have been giving the negative side, showing that the opposite arguments to disapprove it are not valid. Are there any positive proofs? There are, and most valid ones too. No other theory except that of reincarnation accounts for the wide divergence that we find between man and man in their powers to acquire knowledge. First, let us consider the process by means of which knowledge is acquired. Suppose I go into the street and see a dog. How do I know it is a dog? I refer it to my mind, and in my mind are groups of all my past experiences, arranged and pigeonholed as it were. As soon as a new impression comes, I take it up and refer it to some of the old pigeonholes, and as soon as I find a group of the same impressions already existing, I place it in that group, and I am satisfied. I know it is a dog because it coincides with impressions already there. When I do not find the cognates of the new experience inside, I become dissatisfied. When not finding the cognates of an impression, we become dissatisfied. This state of mind is called ignorance. But when finding the cognates of an impression already existing, we become satisfied. This is called knowledge. When one apple fell, men became dissatisfied. Then gradually they found out the group. What was the group they found? That all apples fell, so they called it gravitation. Now we see that without a fund of already existing experience, any new experience would be impossible, for there would be nothing to which to refer the new impression. So, if, as some of the European philosophers think, a child came into the world with what they call tabula rasa, such a child would never attain to any degree of intellectual power, because he would have nothing to which to refer his would have been. He would have nothing to which to refer his new experience. We see that the power of acquiring knowledge varies in each individual, and this shows that each one of us has come with his own fund of knowledge. Knowledge can only be got in one way, the way of experience. There is no other way to know. If we have not experienced it in this life, we must have experienced it in other lives. How is it that the fear of death is everywhere? A little chicken is just out of an egg, and an egg comes, and the chicken flies in fears to its mother. There is an old explanation. I should hardly dignify it by such a name. It is called instinct. What makes that little chicken just out of the egg, afraid to die? How is it that as soon as a duckling hatched by a hen comes near water, it jumps into it and swims? It never swam before, nor saw anything swim. People call it instinct. It is a big word, but it leaves us where we were before. Let us study this phenomena of instinct. A child begins to play on the piano. At first, she must pay attention to every key she is fingering as she goes on and on for months and years. The playing becomes almost involuntary, instinctive. What was the first done with conscious will does not require later on an effort of the will. This is not yet a complete proof. One half remains, and that is that almost all the actions which are now instinctive can be brought under the control of the will. Each muscle of the body can be brought under control. This is perfectly well known. So the proof is complete by this double method, that what we know call instinct is a degeneration of voluntary actions. Therefore, if the analogy is uniform, then what is instinct in lower against animals? In lower animals, what is instinct in lower animals as well as in man must be the degeneration of will. Applying the law we dwelt upon under macrocosm. Applying the law we dwelt upon the under macrocosm, that each involution presupposes an evolution, and each evolution an involution. We see that instinct is involved reason. What we call instinct in man or animals must therefore be involved, degenerated. Voluntary actions and voluntary actions are impossible without experience. Experience started that knowledge, and that knowledge is theirs. The fear of death, the duckling taking to the water, and all involuntary actions in the human being which have become instinctive are the results of past experiences. So far we have proceeded very clearly, and so far the latest science is with us. But here comes one more difficulty. The latest scientific men are coming back to the ancient stages, ancient sagas, and as far as they have done so, there is perfect agreement. They admit that each man and each animal is born with a fund of experience, and that all these actions in the mind are the result of past experience. But what they ask is the use of saying that experience belongs to the soul. Why not say it belongs to the body and the body alone? Why not say it is hereditary transmission? This is the last question. Why not say that all the experience with which I am born is the result a resultant effect of all the past experiences of my ancestors, the sum total of the experience from the little protoplasma up to the highest human being is in me, but it has come from body to body in the course of hereditary transmission. Where will the difficulty be? This question is very nice, and we admit some part of this hereditary transmission. How far? As far as furnishing the material, we by our past actions conform ourselves to a certain birth in a certain body, and the only suitable material for that body comes from parents who have made themselves fit to have that soul as their offspring. The simple hereditary theory takes for granted the most astonishing proposition without any proof that mental experience can be recorded in matter, that mental experience can be involved in matter. When I took at you in the lake of my mind, there is a wave. That wave subsided, but it remains in fine form as an impression. We understand a physical impression remaining in the body, but what proof is there for assuming that the mental impression can remain in the body? Since the body goes to remain in the body, since the body goes to pieces, what carries it? Even granting it where possible for each mental impression to remain in the body, that every impression, beginning from the first man down to my father, was in my father's body, how could it be transmitted to me through the bioplasmic cell? Through the bioplasmic cell. How could that be? Because the father's body does not come to the child in toto. The same parents may have a number of children. Then from this theory of heredity, transmission, where the impression and the impressed, that is to say material, are one, it rigorously follows that by the birth of every child, the parents must lose a part of their own impression, or if the parents should transmit the whole of their impression, then after the birth of the first child, their minds would be a vacuum. Again, if in the bioplasmic cell the infinite amount of impression from all the time has entered, where and how is it? This is a most impossible position, and until these physiologists can prove how and where those impressions live in that cell, and what they mean by a mental impression sleeping in the physical cell, their position cannot be taken for granted. So far it is clear then that this impression is in the mind, that the mind comes to take its birth and rebirth and uses the material which is most proper for it, and that the mind which has made itself fit for only a particular kind of body will have to wait until it gets that material. This we understand. The theory then comes to this, that there is hereditary transmission so far as furnishing the material to the soul is concerned. but the soul migrates and manufactures body after body, and each thought we think and each deed we do is stored in it in fine forms, ready to spring up again and take a new shape. When I look at you, a wave rises and my mind, it dives down as it were and becomes finer and finer, but it does not die. It is ready to start up again as a wave in the shape of a memory. So all these impressions are in my mind, and when I die, the resultant force of them will be upon me. A ball is here, and each one of us takes a mallet in his hands and strike the ball from all sides. The ball goes from point to point in the room, and when it reaches the door, it flies out. What does it carry out with it? The resultant of all these blows that will give it its direction. So what directs the soul when the body dies? The resultant, the sum total of all the works it has done, of the thoughts it has thought. If the resultant is such that it has to manufacture a new body for further experience, it will go to those parents. It will go to those parents who are ready to supply it with a suitable material for that body. Thus, from body to body, it will go, sometimes to a heaven and back again to earth, becoming man or some lower animals. This way it will go on until it has finished its experience and completed this circle. If then knows its own nature, knows what it is, and ignorance vanishes, its powers become manifest, it becomes perfect. No more is there any necessity for the soul to work through physical bodies, nor is here any necessity for it to work through finer or mental bodies. It shines in its own light and is free, no more to be born, no more to die. We will not go now into the particulars of this, but I will bring before you one more point with regard to this theory of reincarnation. It is the theory that advances the freedom of the human soul. It is the one theory that does not lay the blame of all our weaknesses upon somebody else, which is a common human fallacy. We do not look at our own faults. The eyes do not see themselves, they see the eyes of everybody else. We human beings are very slow to recognize our own weakness, our own fault. So long as we can lay the blame upon somebody else, men in general lay all the blame of life on their fellow men, or failing that on God, or they conjure up a ghost and say it is fat. Where is fat? And who is fat? We reap that we sow. We are the makers of our own fat. None else has the blame, none has the praise. The wind is blowing, those vessels whose sails are unfurled catch it and go forward on their way, but which have their sails furled do not catch the wind. Is that the fault of the wind? Is it the fault of the merciful Father, whose wind of mercy is blowing without ceasing day and night, whose mercy knows no decay? Is it his fault that some of us are happy and some unhappy? We make ours own destiny. We make our own destiny. His sun shines for the weak as well as for the strong. His wind blows for saint and sinner alike. He is the Lord of all, the Father of all, merciful and impartial. Do you mean to say that He, the Lord of creation, looks upon the petty things of our life in the same light as we do? What a degenerate idea of God that would be. So are like little puppies making life and death struggle here, and foolishly thinking that even God Himself will take it as seriously as we do. He knows what the puppy's play means. Our attempts to lay the blame on Him, making Him the punisher and the rewarder, are only foolish. He neither punishes nor rewards any. His infinite mercy is open to everyone, at all times, in all places, under all conditions, unfailing, unwavering, unanswering. Upon us depends. How we use it upon us depends. How we utilize it. Blame neither man nor God nor anyone in the world. When you find yourselves suffering, blame yourselves and try to do better. This is the only solution of the problem. Those that blame others, and alas, the number of them is increasing every day, are generally miserable with helpless brains. They have brought themselves to that pass through their own mistakes and blame others. But this does not alter their position. It does not serve them in any way. This attempt to throw the blame upon others only weakens them the more. Therefore, blame none for your own faults. Stand upon your own feet and take the whole responsibility upon yourselves. Say, this misery that I am suffering is of my own doing, and that very thing proves that it will have to be undone by me alone. That which I created, I can demolish. That which is created by someone else, I shall never be able to destroy. Therefore, stand up, be bold, be strong, take the whole responsibility on your own shoulders, and know that you are the creator of your own destiny. All the strength and scores you want is within yourselves. Therefore, make your own future. Let the dead past bury its dead. The infinite future is before you, and you must always remember that each word, thought, and deed lays up a store for you, are ready to spring upon you like tigers. So also there is the inspiring hope that the good thoughts, the good deeds are ready with the power of 100,000 angels to defend you always and forever. So, how is a man reborn? How is a man reborn? By Swami Vivekananda has emphasized upon this fact. In view of the spread of the scientific outlook in the East and of the rebirth doctrine in the West, this clear and concise exposition of the doctrine in retaliation to the findings of the modern biology will be of interest to many people. Life Beyond Death by Swami Vivekananda. Life beyond death. A critical study of spiritualism, the result of direct realization of a yogi with the keenly analytical and searching mind of a scientist. All the knotty problems of souls, pre-existence, immortality, reincarnation have been clearly solved. Doctrine of Karma by Swami Vivekananda. The doctrine of karma and its corollary, the theory of rebirth, are important contribution made by India to world thought. Reincarnation by Swami Vivekananda. Where from are we here, and where are we go, and where we to go hereafter? Did we ever exist before this birth? Shall we continue to exist after death or perish forever? Mystery of Death by Swami Vivekananda. This treatise deals with the comparative study of the different problems of life beyond death and with the different philosophical and psychological inquiries about God and soul and the world. The Problem of Life and Death by Swami Vivekananda contains discussion on life and death. Can destiny be overcome? Reincarnation and evolution, resurrection and immortality. A number of speeches, a number of words, a number of thoughts, ideas have been expressed by our greatest reformer, Swami Vivekananda, emphasized and insisted upon the theory of reincarnation, reformation, recording, returning, So Swami Vivekananda, who suggests us we are to keep in our mind the importance of past equally as our present. For Swami Vivekananda, present, past and future all are the classifications and divergence of time, but the soul is beyond to these things. Similarly, John Donne has explained John Keats' ideas are being similarized here. Wordsworth's ideas are being on some extent similarized here. Whenever anyone want to know the truth of the literature of English and Hindi, there are so many similarities. English and Hindi, both the literatures have come from the intuition, from insight. They have their passage is internal to external, not external to internal. So we must keep these things, these principles, these doctrines in our life practically for leading a happier life. Thanks. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you. I again thank God for your presence, for listening the word of truth through the science and spirituality.